Super. So hello, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Samantha Mustoke. I'm the IFR4NPO Project Director for Humentum, and I'm dialing in from Uganda, where I've lived for 20 years. You're really warmly welcome this afternoon as participants representing a range of stakeholder groups from across the Oceania region, mostly Australia and New Zealand, I should say, but really for the region as a whole. So this meeting is a part of a series of regional events that are being held to promote engagement with the IFR4NPO Consultation Paper. I'm joined today by my very wonderful colleague, Karen Sanderson, who's the IFR4NPO Project Director at SIPFA, so my counterpart at SIPFA, will be taking us through the majority of our time together. If you would, please do take this opportunity to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your organization and your country, so that we all know who's in the room together. You'll notice that we have a live transcript running along the bottom of your screen, which is especially for the benefit of the hard of hearing. If you don't need or want it, then you can turn it off on your own screen from the bar below. Great. I hope you're introducing yourselves in the chat. I'm just going to check it out. Not yet. So please do, if you can access the chat at the bottom. Aha, there we go. Dominic, you kicked us off. Thank you very much. So do access the chat and just let us know who you are. That's great. So onto our agenda for today. We've got a lot to get through and it's a long meeting. So we will move fairly swiftly through and respect your time. It would have been a 2-day meeting had we been in person, so we've squished it all into just 3 hours. If you do have any questions or comments as we go along, please do use the chat function and we'll do our best to answer those as we go along or follow up after the meeting. We hope you're looking forward to sharing your thoughts, and we've set aside some special times for breakout groups for each topic. So within each of those 3 topic times, we will have a short presentation, a breakout group, and then coming back and feeding back into plenary. I should also mention that the 00 at the top is just the start time of the meeting because we're all in different time zones. So you'll have to put that into your own time zone. So today's discussion is intended to help you better understand the consultation paper and for us as a project team to hear your thoughts. But it doesn't constitute a formal response to the consultation. And so we'd really strongly encourage you to submit your own response separately, and we'll tell you how to do that later. So let me start with a very brief overview of the project to set the scene and sort of bring us on the same page. In March this year, the EU Commissioner, Yanis Lenarčič, if that's pronounced rightly, created something of a stir when he said that the biggest barrier to the localization of the biggest barrier to localization is the administrative capacity of local actors when it comes to accountability, transparency, and sound financial management. So he was implying that the reason the EU and probably other donors don't give directly to non-profit organizations operating in countries where funds are needed is because of concerns about capacity and financial transparency. But the capacity problem is really only one side of the story. It's also about having an agreed standard to aim for and work towards. So as you know, non-profit financial reporting standards exist in a few countries like Australia and New Zealand, where they define and harmonize accountability and transparency. And they've had a huge impact on public confidence and the sector's credibility in those countries. But most jurisdictions lack any sector-specific standards for non-profits. So international financial reporting standards, which were developed with input from all stakeholders, are a really important way to create a level playing field. It can be tempting to think of IFR4NPO as a bit of a techie accounting initiative, but actually its aims should be seen in the context of localization, of decolonization, and shifting power in sector. So I'm really, really excited that Humentum and SIPFA are at the center of this work. Really appreciate these are long meetings and the consultation paper isn't a bedtime read. So if you work in an NPO or for a donor, then responding to accounting consultations definitely isn't on your job description, but I really, really want to thank you for being here. So on this slide, you can see the project's sort of theory of change, if you like, in a nutshell. And some of the current challenges experienced by non-profit organizations, by funders, by auditors and regulators stem from this fact that there is no internationally agreed standard for non-profit financial reporting. This results in inconsistency within and between countries, in duplication of producing different reports for different users, high burden, both for preparers and costs. What we also see is that the current focus on project-based grant reporting, rather than a focus on entity-wide fraud, the situation we have now damages the trust and credibility in the sector and creates a barrier to funding. So it's our hope that once the guidance we're developing is widely adopted by jurisdictions, endorsed by resilient, level the playing field and bring more equity to the. So the project is being by human.
I'm sorry, you're just breaking up a little bit, just to let you know.
Sorry.
Your camera off.
Let me stop my. Yeah, let me try that. Sorry about that. Okay. So the project is being, if you want to go on to the next slide, slide 4, Karen, thank you. The project is being led by Humentum and SIPFA, who are both non-profit organizations ourselves. So this project really is sort of by the sector, for the sector. And to support us and to work with us, we have a practitioner advisory group, or PAG, drawn from different parts of the globe who have different roles within the sector. And we also have a technical advisory group drawn from the accounting standard setting community internationally. And then the project is also overseen by a small steering group. So all these wonderful members work on a voluntary basis, and more information about them is available on our website. I know today with us, I think we have Caroline Cordery from our PAG, David Gilchrist, a new addition to the PAG, Anthony Heffernan from the TAG, and Jamie Cotel from the TAG as well. So we have a number of representatives in our meeting today, which we're really delighted about, and Freddie Hauser, I think. So you're all incredibly welcome. So we have the team and the advisory groups, but in terms of the way that we're actually moving forward to deliver this, the project's being delivered in 3 phases, consistent with processes used in setting standards in all international accounting standards. We've just completed the first phase with the publication of the consultation paper at the end of January. And we're now moving into the development phase. And these meetings with you will provide really important input to the project's next steps. Our timetable for the rest of the project will depend a bit on the amount and nature of the feedback to this consultation paper, but we're working towards a draft of the guidance for consultation in 2023 and final guidance in 2025. So the engaging with stakeholders is a really important part of this work, and you can see from this snapshot that we've made fantastic progress in raising awareness and engaging stakeholders all over the world, including international and local non-profit organizations, regulators, donors, auditors, and the accounting community. Now, in addition to the PAG and the TAG, our advisory groups, we're also supported by country champions, who you can see here with the black flags, who help to raise awareness of the project in their countries. And I know Ram is with us today. So if you're a PAG or a TAG or a country champion, maybe you can let us know. Our wonderful country champions help us to raise awareness of the project in their own countries. We also have a donor reference group that includes the World Bank, USAID, Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office in the UK, and others. We don't have any Australian or New Zealand donors at the moment. So if you'd like to join or recommend somebody to join that group, we'd be happy to hear from that. So with that brief introduction, let me hand over to Karen from SIPFA, who will take us through an introduction to the consultation paper and our topics today. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks very much, Sam. I was going to say good morning because it is morning here. In fact, it's still dark here. But from the time that I lived in Australia, it's nice to have an event that is good for you in terms of your time. As you've heard from Sam, the objective of this project is to provide guidance that is internationally applicable and can address known NPO financial reporting issues. So in producing this guidance, we're working to 3 objectives. The first of those objectives is around trying to improve the quality, transparency and credibility of financial reports from non-profit organisations with international high quality guidance that is relevant no matter where you are in the world. The second objective is about providing information that is useful to those who are using the financial statements for accountability and decision making. And in doing so, trying to balance the needs of preparers and users. And then the final objective is about producing NPO specific guidance to help NPOs, and in doing that, trying to improve the comparability of financial reports that they produce. So those are the guidance objectives. So where do we start with this? Well, the consultation paper has been produced to help develop the conversation about financial reporting for non-profit organisations. It's designed to kind of engage with you and with users across the world about what is needed to improve financial reporting for the sector globally. As Sam said, this is not a bedtime read, and we know that paper contains a lot of information, but the main elements are in part 1, which covers general reporting issues, and in part 2, which covers specific accounting issues. You've got an outline of part 1 in front of you. Part 1 is divided into 5 chapters. In our meeting today, we will be touching on all of these chapters. And these chapters focus on which types of organisations we think benefit from the guidance, who are the users of their information, and what is important to these users. Because at the heart of standard setting are the needs of users and producing information that is relevant and of common interest to them. And looking at that in the NPO context, which is something that is different from what the other standard setters do. We'll also be touching on 2 core premises, which is behind the development of the guidance, which is in chapter 3. And then we'll consider the final 2 chapters that look at the extent to which current international standards meet the needs of non-profit organisations and the model that we're proposing to use for non-profits that leverage both international and national standards. And the consultation on part 1 closes on the 30th of July of this year. So turning to part 2, as I said, part 2 of the consultation paper looks at NPO specific accounting issues. And in the final session of today, we'll look at whether we've captured all of the issues and how we've prioritised them for inclusion in the first set of guidance. The issues identified to date cover all aspects of financial reporting, including revenue, expenses, assets, as well as the presentation and disclosure of information. And we'll be looking at holding further outreach meetings later on this year that will look at each of the proposed topics individually. There's quite a lot in this part of the consultation paper, and to give a bit more time for responses to this, the closure of part 2, the consultation period, closes on the 24th of September of this year. So with that kind of just a bit of a brief overview of what's in the consultation paper, we'll turn to our first topic of today, which is about the definition of NPOs, as well as identifying stakeholders and their needs. So first of all, I just want to kind of explain the term NPOs or non-profit organisations, which we use in talking about this project. We're using that term to cover a range of entities, and we recognise that depending on where you are in the world, you may have other terms that you're more familiar with, like non-government organisations, like charities, like membership organisations, trusts. But with the inclusion of such diverse entities as churches, universities and hospitals, it's such a diverse sector that we wanted to have a term that we tried to be inclusive of everybody, and that's why we've landed on non-profit organisations. Just turning kind of now how we're trying to define non-profit organisations. We're proposing that non-profit organisations are characterised by 4 broad characteristics. And in this the characteristics approach, we're proposing that this means that an organisation might be a non-profit organisation if it meets any 4 of the criteria that are both in the consultation paper and on this slide. 3 of the criteria are concerned with an organisation working for social benefit rather than producing a return for investors. So these criteria include delivering services for public benefit, surpluses or losses being used for social benefit, together with assets being used for social benefit rather than, as I said, for financial return. In addition, we have a characteristic around voluntary funding, which can be significant for some NPOs. The existence of voluntary funding may also be important to help distinguish non-profit organisations from governments. So lots of government entities work for social benefit as part of society as a whole, but frequently they're not funded by voluntary donations. So just a helpful perspective to bring to that. In defining non-profit organisation, we recognise that there are already definitions for non-profit organisations that exist internationally, but our view is that these are not designed for financial reporting purposes. The example that you have in front of you is the statistical framework that is used internationally, which has a different definition of non-profits that doesn't recognise that some entities produce profits that are used for public benefit. And you can see that from the slide that there are private market bodies that we might also consider to be non-profit organisations for financial reporting purposes. So what we need for financial reporting doesn't quite fit with the widely used statistical framework, although many of the underpinning characteristics are the same. And we've obviously used this to think about the characteristics that we have defined. I'm going to turn now to stakeholders and their needs. The consultation paper proposes 4 main stakeholder groups: service users. Those are the people that directly benefit from the work of a non-profit organisation. Resource providers, those that provide funds and assets. So these could be donors, or they could be financial institutions such as bank who are providing funding to a non-profit organisation. The third group are regulators, those that set the reporting requirements for non-profit organisations. And the final group here is society at large. This is important because members of the public, even if they are not directly using services for themselves, trust that non-profit organisations are working in the best interests of the communities of which they are a part. And so they have an interest in this too. The consultation paper also proposes 4 main areas of interest for stakeholders, which capture their needs for financial information. These are whether a non-profit organisation is meeting its objectives, is it delivering what it said it was going to do, which is important for stakeholders, is it doing it in a way that maximises economy, efficiency and effectiveness, is it making the best use of the funds that it has available to it, Is it doing it in a way that is compliant with restrictions and regulations that exist? And that would include any restrictions over how it can use any of the funds that it has. And is it operating with regard to its longer term health? Does it have sustainable operations that will mean that the entity can exist for a long period of time? And we think that when these needs are met, they can support accountability to the full range of stakeholders and aid their decision making. It should be noted that these needs are not focused on any one stakeholder or group of stakeholders, but on the common needs of those stakeholders for all NPOs. So that's a brief introduction to what is in chapters 1 and 2 and forms our first topic area. And I'm now going to move on to the third area, which is in chapter 3. And in this chapter, we focus on 2 key premises that we're proposing to underpin the basis of the guidance. And we see this as essential to meeting stakeholder information needs and the guidance objectives. The first premise is that the guidance will be accrual-based. The chapter notes that the types of financial reporting carried out in jurisdictions will depend on a number of factors, and this includes the requirements of local financial reporting guidance, the legal form of an entity, and the influence that donors have over the financial reporting of an entity. And the consultation paper looks at 3 bases of preparing accounts: cash, modified cash, and accrual. And just for clarity, by cash we mean that economic events and transactions are recognised when cash is received or paid, and assets and liabilities are not recognised. By modified cash, we mean that some economic events and transactions are recognised on a cash basis, but others might be recognised on an accrual basis, and therefore some assets and liabilities are recognised. And by accrual, we mean that all economic events and transactions are recognised when the event occurs, with all assets and liabilities being recognised. So those are how we're using those. And in chapter 3, we compare the advantages and disadvantages of each of these bases in terms of how they meet the guidance objectives that I shared with you earlier. And the analysis acknowledges possible challenges around existing knowledge and capability to use accrual-based standards, and also the potential for complexity that it might introduce. It also acknowledges that donors may require cash-based information or information that is not fully accrual-based. But the chapter does conclude that accrual-based accounting is internationally recognised as the best basis to achieve a comprehensive view of an organisation's financial performance and position, and that it improves the quality and transparency of financial reports and enhances accountability for decision making. The second premise is that the guidance will include non-financial reporting in its scope. Arguably, non-financial reporting is more important for non-profit organisations than it is for other types of entity, as it provides an opportunity to explain more about what the organisation is delivering that wouldn't be found in traditional financial statements. So non-financial reporting might include areas such as an entity's nature, what's the purpose of the organisation, its objectives and forward strategy. It could also include risks and regulatory compliance. Non-financial reporting can also be used to demonstrate the impact that projects and programs are having and the benefits that are being developed from its wider activities. So non-financial reporting can provide context to financial information. It can also provide additional information about the organisation's activities that might be useful to meet broader information needs of stakeholders. So that's the end of the introduction to those chapters. And so this is the point where we'll be looking to move into breakout groups. But before I do that, let me just explain how that is going to work. When we move into breakout groups, you'll be automatically allocated to a room. You don't have to do anything. You will be assigned randomly to one of these groups. We suggest that you try to remember which room you are in, just in case you get disconnected. We can reconnect you with the group. And we'll be asking 1 or 2 people from each group to act as a spokesperson to feed back the key points from your discussions. A moderator has been assigned to each group. Their role is to encourage you to contribute, keep you focused on the question, and to kind of probe the reasons for your views. So they're there to help the functioning of the group, and they're not there to be the spokesperson for your group. In terms of protocol, if you could put your hand up if you'd like to contribute, and the moderator will call you in. And we'd ask that if you could please try to avoid talking over each other. If your moderator disappears, please do keep going. And we ask that the last person speaking calls in the next person to continue the conversation. If you have a member of one of the advisory groups or a country champion in your group, they are not there, if you like, representing the project. They will be there to share their own views, just so that you're aware of that. And just more generally, you know, please share your views and your reasons for your views. We will pop the question in the chat box in your room, so you'll be able to see that. And we would ask that for at least the breakout sessions, if you're not doing so already, if you could put your cameras on. It just makes it slightly more intimate when having the group discussions. The breakout room discussions will be recorded, but that is purely for the benefit of the project team. They will not be published, so please be open and frank in your input. The main session is being recorded, so when the feedback goes to plenary, that will be captured as part of the meeting. So here are the questions that will be examined in your groups. The first question is about who are the main stakeholder groups for non-profit organisations in your jurisdiction, and what are current non-financial reporting requirements. The second question is about how accrual accounting might improve accountability and about the accountability arrangements in your jurisdiction. And the third question is about the accounting basis for NPOs in your jurisdictions and about how non-profit organisations are defined. So as I said, you'll be automatically now allocated to your room. You'll have about 30 minutes to discuss those questions. As I said, the moderator there will be there to help you go through those. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we'll ask you to go into your breakout rooms. Thank you. Into the main room. I'd like now to sort of hear back about sort of some of the key points from your discussion. So hopefully your spokespeople are ready to speak. I'll go through the rooms one at a time, but it'd be great if you could just highlight the kind of the key points from your discussion, and if your group has answered the same questions as another group, perhaps if you can just add new points to it, that would be great. So I'm going to start with Nazir. Nazir, could you introduce the question and the spokesperson for your group?
Yeah, so we look at the key stakeholders and the common information for the various stakeholders. And we also look at the inclusion of non-financial information and what are the advantages and disadvantages of including non-financial information. And David will provide the recap.
And who's speaking for your group?
Yeah, David.
David Hardage.
David. Hi, David. Welcome.
Hi.
Great.
So for the stakeholder question, we went through the normal, the donors. We actually talked about the recipients of the services, talked about members, talked about regulators. I guess tax would be included in there. So there really wasn't any new users that hadn't really been discussed with most of the discussions in the consultation paper. So we moved on to other things. I think one of the issues, and we've spent a lot of time on non-financial reporting. Mm-hmm. So one of the questions we had was whether everything could be put in one report, both the financial and the non-financial information, and whether it sort of met the needs of all the users. So on the non-financial side, we wanted to look at getting away from people picking and choosing their own measures, getting away sort of from public relations type material to better alignment, and what are the clearer purposes, or explaining what the organisation's purposes are in a clearer manner that's actually can be understood by the readers. We also talked about, what are those measures of success for the entity? What are they trying to do? We talked about outcomes rather than measures being how much money they've spent and possibly delivery, but actually to what they achieved. When we talked about the non-financial reporting, a lot of people, not a lot, there's a few of us who had come through the Australian Accounting Standards Board project on what we called service performance reporting, that sort of had a lot of pushback and negative comments. And so some of the feedback was related to that experience as to what they were trying to achieve. So personally, I thought they were trying to achieve was essentially what you're trying to achieve, but it didn't go very well. So there's probably some experiences there to go through. And probably it was linked into auditing. How can you audit it? It's a lot easier to audit financial reporting information, a lot harder to report some of this, audit the non-financial reporting information, and where it is located. Is it going to be located in the financial report, which then has to be audited, or can it be at least interim, is it outside the financial report, such as in the director's report, and starting there, and starting sort of simple, rather than possibly mandating it very early on. So I think they're the main points that I had written down.
Great, thank you very much. And so you had a great conversation on the non-financial reporting, which is, I think, wherever we go, always a topic of conversation in terms of how best to use that. So really interested to hear what you said about that. So thank you very much, David. That's great. Thank you. I'm going to turn to Owen next. So I think you had the same set of questions. Can you just confirm that and introduce your spokesperson?
Yes, so we had the same questions, and Karen is going to present on our group.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for that. We had quite a long discussion actually about who the key stakeholders were, and recognised that first there are regulators, and that perhaps a lot of other people might just use what the charity regulator uses. Especially we have people from Australia and from New Zealand, especially.
Carolyn, we're having difficulty hearing you, sorry.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better, thank you.
Okay. Sometimes this happens, I don't know why. So in Australia, the charity regulator gives charities a tick and says that there's minimum requirements being met. So people might just use what is there. We also talked about people who might want to know about the financial sustainability of a charity or a non-profit, especially employees who are quite often involved for a long time in the organisation. And we also spoke about members, so the accountability of the board or the executive back to the organisational members, and how they could be interested in the financials of such an organisation. There was also a comment that the public needs to have confidence in not-for-profits, and perhaps that comes back to the regulator. So I'm not sure that we found any new stakeholders, key stakeholders from the list in the discussion document, but that was an interesting discussion. We also talked about the non-financial performance reporting, and recognised that that wasn't a situation in Australia, but it is in New Zealand. So there were a couple of comments about that. One was that in New Zealand, there could be some costs for compliance generally, and that in fact, philanthropists might want more than is required in the current accounting standards. And I guess that links back to the discussion that we did have, which said that it's very hard to find common requirements for stakeholders' information needs. Quite often they're quite specific. And so they are, as you and I know, general purpose financial reports, and therefore, you know, finding that general purpose can be a little bit difficult. I just wanted to make a comment to the person who just said that auditing is an issue in the non-profit space, to say that New Zealand does have an auditing standard for performance reporting, but that in the UK the audit of the performance reporting is not required at all. So I guess people can, you know, regulators can choose whether or not such non-financial reporting is audited. Yeah. Do you think we've covered that, Owen?
That's brilliant, thank you. And I meant to say, sorry, if any of the members of the groups that either David or Carolyn were in would like to add anything to what they've said, please use the chat function and add any comments that you'd like to make. Carolyn, that was great, thank you very much, and good to hear your discussion of stakeholders. I think we've heard the feedback about kind of employees and actually board members and trustees come up before, and I think perhaps we don't cover them as much in the consultation paper, so good to hear that you've alighted on them. And yeah, I think non-financial reporting will be an ongoing debate as we go through this project, so thank you very much for that. Sam, can I turn to you next, please?
Sure. Yes. So we looked at the question of current accountability arrangements within jurisdictions. We had all Australian members in our group, but a range of different stakeholders. And we also looked at the question of accounting basis, accrual basis. And David Gilchrist is kindly volunteered to report back for us. Thank you, David.
Great. Thank you very much. Hi, David.
Hi, how are you going?
Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. And in terms of the first question, I guess having a entirely Australian group made it a little bit easier in one sense because we're able to grapple with the complexity inherent in Australia rather than multiple countries. But essentially, of course, Australia's a federation, and we identified that not-for-profits and charities have different regulators in relation to different governments, depending on their style of incorporation and what they do. But also recognising that, relatively speaking, I think regulation around the not-for-profit and charitable sector in Australia is relatively new in the context of particularly the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, which oversees, regulates and supervises about 56,000 charities compared to the 600,000 or 700,000 not-for-profits that we have in Australia. We identified a number of elements around that regulatory framework, and I'll just jump through those on dot point by dot point basis. First and foremost, it was observed that organisations can't necessarily afford to undertake financial reporting or develop the financial reporting assets necessary to meet all stakeholders' requirements. And indeed, in terms of reporting to governments, often that can be at a very high level and doesn't necessarily have to be general purpose financial reports. It can be special purpose financial reports. We also identified that there is potential for difficulty in terms of multiple reporting where we have cross-border donations between Australia and other countries. Particularly, it was identified in terms of the US, where of course they have the US arrangements for reporting, and philanthropists or grantors from the US require reporting frameworks to be met in their jurisdiction. But of course, there's still the regulatory requirement in the local jurisdiction as well. The third item, and again in no particular order, but just as these were discussed, was the big question is, who are the users of these reports? And I think that probably is a question that resonates across all of these questions and the broader topic itself as well. But it was quite clear that we're not quite sure who all of the users are for the reports, and therefore the balance between general purpose and special purpose is also a difficult question to respond to and answer. In terms of that reporting complexity or regulatory and supervisory complexity, it was identified as an example that Indigenous corporations have a separate set of legislative requirements that they have to adhere to, but that importantly in the context of financial reporting, while they have to provide a true and fair view of their financial position and performance, they can also have some relief in terms of using general purpose financial reports to meet those requirements. In other words, the legislation recognises the purpose of general purpose financial reports. But the key issue from the regulator's perspective in the case of those organisations is to ensure consistency and comparability across them. In relation to the second question, accrual accounting and how it can possibly help, there were a number of elements, but making sure first and foremost that we recognise that it comes down to the capacity of the entity, and particularly the entities, those charged with governance of the entity and their capacity to understand accounting and to respond to the accounting requirements, and also the user's needs capacity. It was identified too that there is a need for us to balance the requirements of an accounting, or perhaps the predilection to try and make things as simple as possible, with the opportunity for growth in capacity as a result of having requirements, in other words, raising the bar over time and seeing improvements across understandings of financial reporting and how those financial reports are put together. In other words, there's an opportunity in terms of adopting accrual accounting to build skills in this area that are much needed as well. It was, however, iterated a number of times in the discussion that small or micro entities still need to be able to use cash accounting and cash reporting processes in order to balance the use of resources and capacity with the user's needs in the context of, I guess, the relative risk relating to financial reporting in those organisations. I think that's pretty much it, except to observe that Queensland University of Technology has developed a standard chart of accounts for not-for-profit and charitable organisations. This is available through the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission website, but has also been adopted by a number of treasuries around Australia in the context of financial reporting at the state or territory level within this country. I think I've covered everything off very quickly, Sam. I don't know if there's anything that I've missed, but I'm certainly happy to be corrected if I have missed something.
That sounded pretty comprehensive to me, and the same invitation exists. If anyone wants to add anything in the chat to that, please feel free to do so. Some really interesting things that you've raised, that even within a jurisdiction, regulation can be challenging. So, you know, important that we don't forget that and don't just think about a jurisdictional in terms of a country level, that there's other complexities. And yeah, and the capacity and capability points and simplicity. I think the comment was made in a previous roundtable that complexity kills. And so I've taken that to heart. So well remembered. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn to our final group now. Joyce, can you introduce your group, please?
Thanks, Karen. We were in room 3, and the questions that we looked at was...
Well, you've gone on mute, Joyce.
Okay, sorry, Karen. We were in room 3, and the questions that we considered were how are NPOs defined in the jurisdictions, and what are the accounting bases for general purpose financial reportings for NPOs. And I have Ivy who's going to summarize our contributions in our group.
Great, thank you very much. Hi there.
Hi. So we had a group of people from Australia and also a member from New Zealand. In terms of how not-for-profits are defined in our jurisdictions, it was a discussion about definitions flagging that organizations are not attracting profit. So that's a very common factor in the definitions. However, definitions also were affected by different regulators. Different regulators had different definitions, also linked to the objective of the not-for-profit. Also, if the entity had the intention of give a social benefit or having charitable purposes. So that was another component of the definitions. So, but very inclined, the current definition very inclined into if the entity doesn't attract profit, that if that's not the main objective. That was the opening of our conversation. Then moving along into further conversation, we, or the group was inclined into feeling that the definition proposed in the consultation that not-for-profits will be a group of entities that deliver public benefits. It was supported. However, we also had a discussion about how this broad definition can open some questions or can open judgment when we encounter specific cases like organizations that has objectives under the education or religion purposes. So, so the discussion was about the current definition, for example, it could be very black and white, but the new one proposed could open the opportunity for applying some judgment. So that was part of the conversation. And then moving into how general purpose financial reporting is done, we discussed about having different tiers, and depending on the size of organizations, there is an opportunity to do cash or accrual basis, depending on this and the size of the organization. How this is enforced, particularly in Australia, we have a regulator, the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commissions, and then there are some parameters that charities need to follow in that arena. And we also discuss about having a different, having more complex scenarios in which not-for-profit have different sub-entities that might have profits, and how to consolidate this in the financial reporting. But overall, the consensus is that accrual basis is the more financially transparent and healthy way to communicate to the stakeholders. And also we talk about potentially some proposals about having a modified accrual basis, which is in between cash and accrual, that can give some flexibility to some small to medium entities.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Another different conversation, but actually alighting on some of the same points made in the other discussions, which is really interesting as we try and pull all of that together. Thank you very much, Ivy, for your feedback. Some really good discussion there, but I'm going to move us on and back to the presentation. So we're going to move on to a new topic area now, and this is really looking at what guidance already exists and how that can be used to develop the guidance. Excuse me, my computer is frequently slow at moving on. Okay. So we're proposing to start with guidance that already exists, because that will help us to produce the guidance more quickly. past experience has shown that starting from scratch to develop accounting standards takes a long time, and the need globally is now. And that may be less so in your jurisdictions where you already have standards, but I think, as Sam said at the very beginning, a number of jurisdictions don't have standards, and so we want to move rapidly to support those. So in our work, we've looked at existing international guidance as well as national guidance, and as with the case with Australia and New Zealand, a number of countries have developed NPO-specific standards for use by non-profits in those jurisdictions. Our experience of national guidance tends to be that standards are built on standards being used for the private or public sectors, or sometimes both. Our experience is also that standards are designed to meet country-specific context, which take account of both the legal requirements as well as community expectations. So we've seen that national guidance can be built on an international framework or on a local gap, and that varies considerably. So individual topics in national guidance can appear different depending on where you are in the globe. And whilst national guidance has been developed through local due process with well thought out positions, it hasn't been considered outside of an individual country's context and hasn't been through international due process. So to increase the likelihood of global adoption, the view of the project team is that non-profit guidance should be based on an international framework that has been through international due process with an accepted conceptual base. And so that's kind of where we've landed on balancing those two up. So having concluded that international guidance would provide a better base, Chapter 4 examines the extent to which the three existing frameworks, that's IFRS, IFRS for SMEs, and IPSAS, International Public Sector Accounting Standards, would allow the project objectives to be met. And to do this, we assessed each of the frameworks against three criteria. Firstly, whether the framework would address NPO-specific issues. Secondly, the likely familiarity that non-profits have with the standards, and related to that, how easy it will be to use that framework. And then we looked at feasibility and the feasibility of producing guidance within the project resources and timeline. The analysis in the chapter shows that no one framework performs well across all of those criteria. IPSAS performed better on NPO-specific accounting issues, and this is because there are likely to be similarities with certain transactions, particularly transactions that are for social benefit, where there's commonality there. But IFRS for SMEs perform better on ease of use and feasibility, primarily because it's a single standard intended for use by a variety of bodies. And some of the complexities that exist in IFRS and IPSAS have been removed from IFRS for SMEs to simplify it. And also IFRS for SMEs is only updated periodically, unlike IFRS and IPSAS suites of standards that are under constant review. So with greater gaps between review, it's also a more stable basis. And because of that, we felt that it was kind of more feasible for the project team to build on this standard with the resources that we have available. So with no one framework meeting all of the needs, we are proposing a model that accesses all of them, including national standards. So we're proposing a model that uses IFRS for SMEs as a foundational framework, given its stable base. And by stable, I mean it's less frequently updated. But as I've just said, we know that IFRS for SMEs does not address all NPO specific issues. So in this model, we are proposing that full IFRS and IPSAS and their conceptual frameworks would also be used where IFRS for SMEs does not address a specific issue. And we would also propose at the same time that the model draws on jurisdictional level guidance to develop NPO specific reporting solutions. We think that this approach accesses the most appropriate elements of existing guidance without starting from scratch. The paper does acknowledge a concern that using different sets of guidance may lead to inconsistencies. However, in our analysis, we've noted that the differences between IFRS and IPSAS primarily relate to public sector issues. There are many similarities between the frameworks where transactions are the same. And similarly with national guidance, many of them are either built on an international framework or are aligned with an international frameworks. So whilst we accept that there may be differences, with many similarities, that those differences may be minimal. So with that introduction to what is in chapters 4 and 5, we'll move into our next breakout session. So these are the questions for this breakout session, can't get my words out. So thinking about the organisation that you work for or organisations that you work with, the first question is about the knowledge of international frameworks that exists. The second question is about the proposed guidance model and whether there are things that you think would make it more easy or more difficult to either adopt or have that model accepted. And the third question is about the importance that you place on use of existing international frameworks, particularly in the context of existing national guidance that exists. So those are the three question areas for this topic. As before, you'll be automatically allocated to a breakout group, and your moderator will let you know which questions you are answering. You'll have 20 minutes to look at this question. And so Dominique, if you could allocate people to their room now, that would be great. Thank you very much. The room now. Thank you very much. Welcome back again into the room. Same as before, we'd just like to go around each of the groups and get a summary of the discussion that you had in your groups. So I might start with Sam. Can you introduce your question for your group?
Sure. So we were looking at the proposed model and what would make it easier or difficult to adopt in the jurisdictions. And Ram has kindly offered to feedback for us. Thanks, Ram.
Thank you, Sam.
Hi, Ram.
Hi, Karen. And hello, everyone. So we debated the question in the context of the potential frameworks that are being considered, and IFRS for SMEs being one of them. And I think all of us in our group were from Australia, so any comments I suspect would have been in that context. So we were looking at IFRS for SMEs as a potential option, and there was some question around whether there is any knowledge in the local markets around that particular standard. Then there's, of course, IPSAS, which isn't adopted in Australia, so there's that as well. Australia adopts IFRS for all its reporting needs, so we use the transaction neutral approach in that context, so all sectors use the same set of standards with modifications where required. One of the questions was around, even if we use IFRS for SMEs, which is around 250 odd pages, what are the changes that are going to be made to it, if that was the standard that was used, to make it not-for-profit specific? I think the comment made was around the UK model, which does use the IFRS for SME standard for its own reporting purposes in the not-for-profit space. and that standard is around 400 odd pages. So where does the difference come? Why is there more material in a local variant, if you wish? In the Australian context, adopting any guidance that may arise out of this is probably going to be more a long-term solution rather than something in the medium to short term. So that's a couple of reasons for that. One is that obviously the project has to come to its conclusion and the guidance issued, which may take a few years. And also we've got a local project that's already looking at getting a solution in sooner rather than later. Also, there was a question around, is the IFR4NPO solution suitable for smaller not-for-profits or micro not-for-profits? And I think the general consensus is that it's unlikely to meet that demand. So we do know that there are reporting needs in that space. So what solution, if any, is going to be made available for that particular segment? That's an open question, I suppose. Smaller not-for-profits, once again, will find any potential guidance arising out of this challenging, even though it's based on a simpler standard IFRS for SMEs potentially. And I think the comment made was general practitioners who are normally involved in the preparation of financials for such smaller not-for-profits are not necessarily technical experts who are across all the requirements, and they will need something a bit more simpler, if you wish, for use in the smaller not-for-profit space. That pretty much sums up, I think, what our group discussed. If I've missed anything, please do shout out. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that, Ram. And as I said before, if anyone wants to add anything, please use the chat function to do that. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, you know, Australia and New Zealand are both kind of mature in terms of NPO reporting. So not too many surprises in there. And I think it's important that you've flushed out the issues for smaller NPOs. So good to hear your thoughts on that. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to Owen. Owen, can you tell us about your group and what you were looking at?
Thank you so much, Karen. We were looking at the questions, what knowledge of international framework exists in your jurisdiction among NPOs, their auditors and stakeholders? To what extent do you think framework based on international frameworks would be accepted in your jurisdiction? What benefits would you envisage and what issues do you foresee? So, of course, David took much of the moderation, but we had, Nazar took much of the moderation, but we had David who going to present for us.
Thank you. So it's pretty straightforward, but as always, if anyone in the group wants to add, please do. In terms of knowledge of the international frameworks, we felt two things essentially. One, that we think that there are significant knowledge gaps across the profession, including the auditing profession, in the context of those international standards. And that's not necessarily to say that they are unaware of the standards as they might be applied in Australia, but there tends to be an application of the standards, for instance, in Australia via the Australian Accounting Standards Board. And so underlying international arrangements that might support the Australian Accounting Standards Board pronouncements might not be have a high awareness, if you like, in the profession. We identified that there was a likelihood that auditors were particularly assisting small and perhaps medium organisations to understand their reporting requirements. So those charged with governance were relying on advice from auditors, and auditors certainly cited supporting those boards to understand the standards and understand their reporting obligations. I guess in terms of the second question then, and the benefits around an international arrangement. I think we identified essentially 3 responses. The first one was that there's an opportunity in an international setting for more discussion and greater innovation as a result of looking perhaps at different ideas through different lenses, but bringing those ideas back to the local conditions and conforming those to the local conditions through an accounting standards board at the local level was an important consideration. We identified that large charities can adopt these kinds of changes and have some resource to be able to do that, but that small charities would have, small not-for-profits rather, would have some significant problems, we thought. But we did think too that there is an opportunity in the context of those international setting frameworks to enhance local standards. I guess the final point is that, of course, those international arrangements also allow for the opportunities for countries that can't really afford to have their own standard setting arrangements in place to be able to rely on that international arrangement. And we talked about the idea, for instance, of advertising to those countries so that they can be aware of what's happening in the context of the international standards platforms and arrangements. Overall, we thought adoption can be, certainly in the Australian context, can be quite complex given, I guess, the comments that we made in the previous discussion about the nature of regulation in Australia as well. I hope that synopsises everything well enough for my group, and obviously please jump in if there's anything that needs to be stated more clearly.
Great, thanks very much, David, for that. And I can feel some sort of groundswell building in terms of some common themes coming out of the discussion, particularly around smaller entities, but some really interesting points there about, you know, how we can leverage off each other to greater benefit in terms of looking at solutions to some of these issues. So that's really good. And again, if anyone wants to add anything to what David said, please jump into the chat. We can pick up your comments there. So finally, to the final group, Joyce, can you talk to your question, please?
Thanks, Karen. The questions that we considered were the importance placed on using existing international frameworks for international NPO guidance. And then the second one, it was how will common solution to your accounting issues improve accountability and decision making? And we have Leanne who's going to summarize for us what we discussed.
Great, thank you. Hi there.
Hi, thanks for that. Look, in relation to the first question around the use of frameworks, international frameworks, there's general agreement that we're a bit young in the use of international frameworks. We haven't had a lot of experience with it. The ACNC, which is our regulatory body, is very young. It's only about 8 years old. And as not-for-profit organisations, we haven't had a lot of exposure to international financial reporting standards. And we haven't yet gone down the path of IFRS for SMEs either, but we recognise those as effective. We wouldn't want NFP-only professional quarantining, as it were. So we certainly want the profession to be familiar with international financial reporting standards across the board, not just NFP. And of course, international standards are, having an impact on the growing complexity of standards and reporting. So there were the things that were brought up. And in relation to the common solutions, it was generally felt that common solutions have the best potential to provide consistency, transparency, and to support comparability and accountability. It's important to eliminate options for interpretation and application. A good point was raised about for research teams, for example, they're frequently going across to international granting bodies across different jurisdictions. So a common standard or common solutions is easier in terms of applying for grants and satisfying those bodies in terms of reporting. So a common standard helps to support research efforts. It also depends on the common solution. If there's differences in understanding and application, then that creates the same problem with comparability that we have currently. And I understand in New Zealand, they have application of international financial reporting standards at different tiers. So those differences in terms of common solutions have arisen for the lower tiers, I think, for smaller organisations. So they're the range of issues that we discussed.
Great.
Please
Thank
add
you.
if I've missed anything.
Thanks very much, Leanne. And as she said, if there's anything anyone wants to add, please feel free to add to the chat. Yeah, no, look, common solutions, it's good to see the same words keep coming up: accountability, consistency, comparability, and transparency, which I think is obviously what we're looking to achieve here, and kind of linking into international standards, making sure that everyone kind of understands them and uses them appropriately. That's great. Thank you very much. I'm just going to finish this session by looking at how you can respond to the consultation. And I'm going to ask Sam just to pick this up if you can. There we go. Is Sam there? Have we lost Sam?
Here, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, super. So let me just, sorry, which slide are we on, Karen? Help me.
Submitting a response. Can you not see it?
Just the slide number,
So you're at 21?
Aha, yeah, that's it. Okay, sorry. So thank you. Yeah, so we've taken you through part one and those chapters in part one of the consultation paper. And we really hope you're ready to submit a response to the consultation. So wanted to give you a heads up on how to do that. We've tried to make it as easy as possible, and there are 3 different ways you can share your views. And if you go to the project website, IFR4NPO.org, all the information is there. So if your organisation already has a process for submitting comments on accounting standards, then you can submit a comment letter in the normal way.
So I think we might be losing Sam. Sorry, you might need to take your camera off.
Okay, let's try that. So then if you would, so that's the comment letter as option 1. If you'd like to submit a response as an organisation or collaborate with others to work offline.
I think we might be losing.
Karen, I think my line might be not good enough. Would you mind taking over for me?
Pick up, no problem. So I think as Sam was saying, if you want to collaborate with others or work offline, there is a template available on the website that you can download. It's a Word template, and there are 2 templates on there, one for part 1 and one for part 2. The third option, which is great if you are submitting as an individual, is an online survey. There are separate surveys for part 1 and part 2. And once you've started it, you input your personal information, country, stakeholder, etc., and you can save it and you can come back to it multiple times until you are ready to submit. So 3 different ways of being able to submit a response. And after this session, we hope that you're feeling motivated and most importantly, confident to submit a response, even if you've never done something like this before. A large number of responses from all regions of the world will add quality and credibility to the guidance that we produce. I think sometimes there's a temptation where you're in a more mature environment where you've already got standards to think that it's not for you, but actually we really want to hear from everyone. So that's part one wrapped up. We're now just going to take a 10-minute break just to stretch your legs, go to the bathroom, etc. And before getting into our final session. So we'd be grateful if you could be back promptly so we can look at the approach to individual accounting issues. So if we could take a 10-minute break and see you back here at 17 minutes past the hour. Thanks very much, everyone. On the list at all. With such a long list of issues, we've needed to decide where to prioritise our effort to achieve the highest impact for the first set of guidance. So we intend to focus on those issues that could add the greatest value globally within the project timeline and resources. And to do that, we've used 4 prioritisation criteria. The first of those is prevalence. That is the issue widespread globally? Is it seen in a lot of places? Consequence, and this is looking at the consequence for users. Does not addressing the issue, excuse the double negative, impair the ability of the reader of financial reports to obtain useful information for accountability and decision making? So yeah, is there a consequence for the user if we don't address this? The third criteria is about demand. Are people coming to us? Are multiple stakeholder groups raising the same issue, or is there a single stakeholder group internationally and the demand is internationally to address a particular issue? And the final one is around feasibility. So can a technically sound solution be found within the time and resources available and not adversely impact the rest of the project? For example, we wouldn't want to spend all of our time on only one issue. We think that we can add greater value by addressing a number of issues. So we want to try and balance this out. So using these criteria, we've prioritized those issues that rate the most highly across all of the criteria. And as part of the consultation, we ask whether this is the right way to do it. Have we got the right criteria that is helping us to prioritize issues for inclusion in the consultation paper? But using these criteria, we have come up with 10 proposed topics. And these are the ones that we've determined to have the highest priority for inclusion in the consultation paper. And if I can pick out a few of these, we are proposing to include non-exchange revenue. And this topic would include grants received, donations received, gifts in kind, and services in kind. And based on what people have said to us and our understanding of the issues associated with this, we would cover recognition and also how to determine the value of gifts and services in kind, so measurement issues as well as disclosures. We're also proposing to look at the classification of expenses. And in this, we're looking at what sort of analysis should be being used, where international standards allow for an analysis by nature or function. So this looks at, do we prefer one kind of analysis over another, and whether there should be defined categories for non-profit organisations to use. And another area, just a final one to pick out, is the presentation of financial statements, where we are looking at how funds with restrictions are presented in the financial statements. And this includes what is commonly called fund accounting as part of the discussion. So we've identified these issues because we think they are prevalent. There are consequences for the readers if they're not addressed. We think there is a demand for this globally, and we think we can address this within the project resources. And the consultation paper asks for your views about whether these are the right issues for us to focus on. Just before we move on to the questions that we'd like to discuss around the NPO issues and how we get to a list of issue, I just wanted to touch on donors. That has frequently come up in both discussions we had before the consultation paper and in the regional events we've had. And we've heard a lot about the implications of donor requirements and the impact they can have. And Sam mentioned at the beginning that we've set up a donor reference group. And I just wanted to kind of reinforce that, their role here will, the role of this group and our interface with them will be about better understanding the perspective of donors. And we'll be able to feed their thoughts into these topics, and hopefully we will get greater consistency out of it, because that's what we're aiming to do. So just in case there were any donor perspectives to it, I just thought I would bring that up. So back into questions again. And so we've got 3 questions again that could come up in the groups that you are in. Question 1 is about how you prioritize NPO reporting issues. So we're asking you to look at this through the lens of your top 3 issues and kind of why those are the most important to resolve. So we want to try and understand what are the factors that mean that some issues have got higher priority than others. The second question is about the most significant NPO specific accounting issues in your jurisdictions. What are the ones that lead to reporting difficulties? And the third question is about, again, common solutions to accounting issues and how that will improve accountability in decision making, again looking at it through the lens of specific accounting issues. So Dominic, if you could push people back into breakout rooms, that would be great. And there's about 20 minutes to discuss the question that's been allocated to your group. Welcome back for the final time as part of this meeting. So as before, it'd be good to hear what you were discussing in your groups. So I'm going to start with, I think you were first back in the room. Is it yourself or is it Nazir who's going to feedback? You're on mute, Owen. That's okay.
So we're tackling question, what are your top 3 accounting issues? Why are they the most important to resolve? And are these the most important issues across your area? Or why would you prioritize some issues over? So Jeanette was so kind to volunteer herself to present on our behalf.
Great, thank you. Hi, Jeanette.
All right. Hi. We had a bit of difficulty narrowing it down to 3 in the end, but I think probably the one that's possibly sitting at the top of the list is revenue and all the different aspects and so on that go with revenue recognition. Yep. Then one of the other ones is the whole issue of non-financial reporting and how to communicate the information that people want. Also, some of the areas about what to do with concessionary, like donations for lower than fair value, inventory you get given, those sorts of issues. And then we sort of had a discussion about, moved on to broader areas in a sense that ranged from the aspects of bigger groups and where control sits. And so what's your reporting entity and what's appropriate to include and not include based on the control definitions, and sort of at the group size, and then ranging down to the other side about the difficulties that really small charities have trying to comply with comply with whatever requirements that they should have, balanced against the accountability, the need for accountability in a sense, because they are charities and because they're getting other people's money, that it's possibly not appropriate to not provide them with some form of definite accounting and expectations, because they have a level of accountability to a broad range of stakeholders that perhaps is a bit different from a for-profit space where the stakeholders are a bit different. And then we talked a bit about the spectrum of the types of entities, from the really big entities that sort of act a bit like corporates because that's sort of the size they are. Then in the middle challenges about where you've got mixed groups, that you've got a not-for-profit that's got for-profit subsidiaries, and how you deal with all of those sorts of issues as well. And then we talked about dealing with expenses and how to present the financial information, and maybe you present it on a program basis, or that you present it on a function, nature, that sort of stuff, to try and promote the consistent information.
Great.
So hopefully that covers everything we sort of ranged across.
And reassuring to see that they are a lot of the topics that we had on our priority.
Yes, I think you'd hit the nail on the head.
Very, very encouraging in doing that. And can I just ask, just a follow up? So, what made revenue the top one? That one stood out for you. What was it about that kind of?
Well, I think within the Australian context in particular, we have attempted to apply IFRS 15 in the not-for-profit sector, because we apply IFRS-based standards, and I think there's all manner of cans of worms in there that we've discovered that people, I think grants and I can't think of some of the other, but yes, there's been a lot of things that have occupied the minds of a lot of people even on our accounting standards board over quite a while, to just how to deal with them in an appropriate way in the not-for-profit sector.
Brilliant. Great, thank you very much. And as before, if anyone wants to add anything, please use the chat to add any comments to what Jeanette's just fed back there. That's really great. Thank you very much. So Nazir, I think, are you presenting the next group?
So our discussion was around what are the most significant accounting issues in your jurisdiction? How does this differ between donor and regulatory reporting requirements? And will the proposed guidance model provide solution to these issues in your jurisdiction? And Friedrich will provide a summary of our discussion.
Right.
Thank you. So yeah, the number of the topics are actually not the different, actually same from what Jen just covered. So revenue recognition was out there. There was a specific comment made that the differentiating between what is the exchange, non-exchange, to use the IFR4NPO terminology, and therefore, which standard to apply is one of the complexities involved in that. Obviously, we have a new. Those are new standards that entity just went through, so there is obviously pain with the initial application in it. The non-financial reporting was mentioned as well, having said that there are possibly differing views as expected, and those that would probably caution to make it mandatory, which is again in line what we have been hearing, obviously cost associated or auditability associated with that, etc. Just mentioned in the previous session too. The measurement was discussed particularly in relation to the concession releases. So I think it goes back again to comment what Janet made in relation to assets donated or otherwise acquired below their or for the consideration below the fair value. So I think that's definitely a topic that is still subject to discussion in Australia. Other topic that wasn't mentioned already is investments and the complexity of financial instruments related standards and their application in not-for-profit space, and possibly unintended consequences mixing up investing and operating activities in one P&L measure, and possibly to maybe isolate, similar to equities that favorably fuel CI, outcomes of investment activities of not-for-profits being not that main area of their operations. Fundraising was something that those that spoke, we did not necessarily would put it on a top list, or at least would prevent or caution to force against some unintended consequences. Seem probably not dissimilar discussion around to the service performance reporting. If it can provide great value, but to users, but also it can result on some even perverse outcomes if used or presented inappropriately or simplistically. Going through down the list, CapEx versus OPEX and presentation of expenses was one of the other topics mentioned. And I think the intergeneration equity, long view versus annual view, was mentioned in the chat. And personally, I'm translating it maybe as a difference between focus on financial performance reporting and maybe almost integrated reporting, contribution to the society of the entity over the long term. That should be probably more focus of foreign FP entities. I'm hoping that I covered everything, but happy for the other members of the backup group to chip in. I think related parties was mentioned, and that's something that is obviously in Australia subject to, it's already required, but they are obviously is increased focus in this area.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. Thank you very much for that, Freddie. Again, lots of commonality, one with Jeanette, but obviously with what we've picked out of the project. Interesting feedback on fundraising and probably related parties was probably the one that's come up most frequently in the other regional groups as something of concern. Thank you very much. And I say, if there's anyone wants to add anything, please do add it into the chat, and I can see someone has done that, so that will be great. So turning just to our third group now, Joyce, can you introduce your group?
Thanks, Karen. So we looked at how will common solutions to your accounting issues improve accountability and decision making. And we also looked at, are there any solutions that would support other NPO improvement projects relevant to your jurisdiction? And we have Joe Shannon who's going to represent our group.
Thanks. Hi, Joe.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you. Look, I think in some ways the group struggled with the question a bit, so feel free for the rest of the group if they want to come in on this, and therefore I struggle with the answers, but I think they didn't struggle with the question because of the validity of the question. I mean, I think there was a strong view in the group, that achieving consistency, support accountability, supports better decision making, supports, gives confidence to more confidence to the regulator. All those issues are a good thing, but there was a lot of skepticism about whether it can be achieved. And I guess there was some concerns raised about the major differences in jurisdictions, differences in standard setting processes. All those issues play into whether it can be achieved, the common solutions. And so I think that became the sort of major question, really. But nevertheless, people, there was a consensus was that it was a really important, people were generally engaged in wanting it to happen. That was really important for international charities that it does happen. Yeah. So the bigger question is the value of the principle itself, but and the need for it, but how do you achieve it? This seemed to be the major question. How can it happen? How will it happen, I guess? Yeah. And a bit similar to one of the previous groups when they talked about the impact of the new revenue standard and the application of that and the can of worms that's been in the charity sector in Australia. I'd probably put the same issue into play when it comes to non-financial assets and accounting for those, which is also on your list, and the introduction of some new standards in that area, particularly with leasing, but other areas too in Australia in recent times. What a can of worms that's been. I don't think there's any real appreciation when the standard setting is done of the complex arrangements under which not-for-profits own non-financial assets, use non-financial assets, occupy non-financial assets, and how all that plays into their particular charity environment. And so I think how you find solutions in that area are so different than the for-profit area, because the whole arrangements for non-financial assets in the not-for-profit space, it's so different than the arrangements for non-financial assets in the for-profit environment. You're starting from a different position and a different purpose. And so I guess that's just one example, I guess, of the challenges and issues we have in coming up with common solutions. Anybody else in the team, feel free to add to that if I've missed something.
Great. No, thank you for that. I mean, it's sorry that you struggled with the question, but it sounds like you had a good discussion in spite of the question that we raised in terms of, as you quite rightly point out, some challenges that are in front of us. We know that this is not an easy project, which we suspect is why no one's attempted it in the past to do it in this way. And it's important that we do flush out all of those issues so that we have the best chance of making a success of it. So it's really useful to get your feedback on that and the feedback of the group. So if anyone else has got anything that they would like to contribute to that, as I said, please feel free. Please do use the chat or contact us subsequently. So we're now moving into kind of the final part of today's meeting, and I've just got a couple of final slides to take you through. I mean, I have found this kind of really interesting to hear your views and stimulating, because it makes such a difference to us as a project team to feel that all of this is real and resonates. And your feedback gives us real colour and a regional view on some of the issues that we've discussed, which is invaluable for us. But as Sam said earlier, your words here do not constitute a formal response to the consultation paper. And so hopefully today has helped you engage a bit more with what's in the consultation paper and clarify some of the proposals and help you shape your views on that. So the most important next step that we would encourage, if you can, is to go ahead and submit a formal response, either as an individual or as an organisation. So as a reminder, the closing dates are the 30th of July for part 1 and the 24th of September for part 2. But of course, having discussed part 1 today, you might find it easier to respond to that sooner rather than later, or some of the issues are fresh in your mind. And we showed you earlier how to do that, but all of the information is on the IFR4NPO website. You might be curious as to know what happens to all your responses and what happens next. We will be analysing the responses from Q3 of this year and using the information that you provide to us to help shape the development of the draft guidance. as I think Sam said a bit earlier, it will depend a bit on the quantity of responses and the nature of the responses that we get. But our hope is to issue draft guidance for comment in 2023. But we will continue to do outreach work over that period. So it's not an engagement now and kind of we forget you for a period. We're keen as part of our stakeholder engagement to try and ensure that all groups with an interest and with an influence over the project are able to continue to input. So if you are interested, this won't be the last that you hear from us. So how can you stay connected and engaged during this process? Please, if you haven't done so already, subscribe to our quarterly newsletters. This will keep you up to date and also ensure you're aware of relevant regional events. Sam will hopefully put the links to this in the chat. Sam, if you're not able to do that, let me know. And we would say, well, please join the conversation in the online forum. This is a forum where stakeholders can connect and learn and share with one another. And you can participate in a hot topic series focusing on specific issues every couple of weeks. The forum has been down from maintenance, but we're hoping that will be up again very shortly. And please do follow us on social medias, specifically LinkedIn and Twitter. If you are active there, it would be good to do that. If you comment, share, or like our posts, they get seen by more people and more voices can be heard. This sector is a huge sector and we know there's many people that we need to reach out to. So the more that we can raise the profile of this and you can contribute to that, absolutely, the better. And you can always email the project. You can email Sam. Sam is putting her address in the chat as well, but you can also email me as well. Very happy to hear from you. We will be sending a follow-up email with the PowerPoint presentation and the recording so that you've got a record of this, and those will also be available on the website. And if you have colleagues in other parts of the world who you think would be keen to come to similar events in their regions, please check out the page that Sam is putting in the chat, which is on the website, that will enable you to do this. And before we close, Sam, are you able to take a picture? Sam is having internet.
Yes, I can do that.
Yeah, so we'd love to get a photo of everybody to continue our social media campaign. So Sam, are you ready to do the photo? If everyone could turn their webcam on and smile, big beaming smiles would be absolutely awesome. Sam, are you good?
I'm good. I'd love a couple more webcams on if possible. Makes for a better picture.
You do a couple more webcams.
Have
you got it?
Yeah, okay, so 3, 2, smile. Lovely, got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It's been a real pleasure meeting you all and hearing from you.
Yeah, so thank you again for your time, effort and insights. We got some really useful information that you've shared with us today, which is just really helpful for taking this forward. And we really do appreciate it, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you on our journey to develop the world's first internationally applicable financial reporting guidance for non-profit organisations. So thank you very much, and have a good day, great week. I think some of you are entering evening time, so have a good evening and goodbye, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Is it just us now? I know we still got, yeah. And then there were 6. Oh.
Great, well done, Karen. Sorry about my network, it's a real challenge today.
Recording. Sorry, do I pause the recording or stop the